There we go.
Okay. Well, welcome to Too Late for the Gods. Kyle Alander was kind enough to come back to finish the conversation we started 2 weeks ago. And to refresh memories, this is his response to my earlier video refuting Richard Swinburne's argument for God from simplicity. Just to recap, my concerns with Swinburne were, first of all, an argument from simplicity kind of relies on a medieval concept of the cosmos. And in the last couple of centuries, if there's anything we've learned, there's nothing simple or rational about this universe. The more we learn, the less we understand. It's not a simple universe, so an argument from simplicity probably isn't a valid one. On the other hand, if we were to take him seriously, or grant his argument from simplicity, one substance, the physical world, is simpler than adding metaphysical substance on top of that. So I'm not sure that the argument simplicity would attain anyway. Second, my second problem with Swinburne is it's merely a metaphysical explanation. And when you assert a metaphysical existence, first of all, there's no compelling reason to accept that premise. And second, the thing about a metaphysical assertion is you can make it any way you want. If I'm going to posit a God, I can shape this God to fit any objections that come up, kind of as Bertrand Russell showed in his example. And third was Swinburne's reliance on fine-tuning and intelligent design, which rely really on very, very bad probabilities. And there's a big question about the applicability of Bayesian probabilities to our existence here. So that's kind of a recap. Last time we talked about simplicity and we talked about metaphysics. And I'm going to let Kyle once again open it up because he had some comments on what I said last time. Kyle?
Yeah, so I'm just reading off what you sent me in your email. So you said, simplicity is a metaphysical principle based on obsolete understanding of the cosmos. And you talk about quantum theory and how there's no such thing as a substance. I know last time we discussed a little bit about how I think we both agree that like space and time are like sort of constructs of some underlying reality. However, I think what Swinburne, so I guess a few clarifications. So when Swinburne is talking about simplicity, he's mainly what he's talking about is what's called syntactical simplicity. So I'm going to share my screen real quick just to get sort of a visualization of what I'm talking about. Let's see here. This is from Facebook, so I don't know. Can you see that?
Yeah, I'll put it up.
Okay. So this is from Reality Theology. Now, I don't necessarily agree with at least this particular comparison. I think more can be said for each side. But so when you talk about simplicity, is basically, so if you look on the left here, you have Oppie's view, right? So you have all these brute facts, all these like brute necessities. And these brute necessities sort of explain everything else. Like they explain the universe, they explain morality, they explain religious experiences. They have these sort of like different explanations for different phenomena. Whereas on the right here, you see Kuhn's view, where you have one single sort of like entity, right, that can sort of then make sense of these other entities right over here. Now, again, like I said earlier, I don't necessarily agree with this comparison. There's another comparison that I'm going to go over in a little bit that I think is a little better, sort of fits better with my view. But I guess the point here is when Swinburne, when he's talking about simplicity, he's talking about the simplicity, the fundamental kind of entities we're trying to explain. And I guess just a little quote, not quote, but a sort of point I want to, let me see if I can find it. Okay, so in work in regards to simplicity, I think his name is Trent Dowdery. He wrote a paper on the new atheist approaches to religion. And when he talks about simplicity, he goes over different kinds, but one of the things that he points out is that theism postulates one brute fact, and everything else flows from it in conjunction with necessary truths about value and an appeal to the most familiar kind of explanation, personal explanation. Bare theism's brute fact is the existence of a person with two properties, knowledge and power, held in the simplest possible way. The explanation of every contingent truth is a function of the goodness of the corresponding state of affairs. Since there is no best possible world, at times an arbitrary choice must be made as to which initial world segment to actualize among sufficiently good initial world segments. Naturalism lacks this kind of fundamental explanatory simplicity and systematically. There will be quite a number of brute facts, at least not of which the existence of massive quantities of contingent beings, the fundamental particles out of which the physical universe is composed. Counting up the number of brute facts in naturalism will be difficult, but it seems to be inevitable, as it postulates more than one brute existent with only two properties held in the simplest way. The only way to have, theism only postulates, one thing with these two properties. The only way to have a simpler theory on the axiomatic theory of simplicity is to postulate one entity with a single property held in the simplest way. And there is currently no naturalistic theory which can, meet this criteria. Basically, he's pointing out that naturalism, pretty much all forms of naturalism, regardless if it's the most conservative naturalism, which is like a source physicalism, or you have like a very liberal naturalism, which is like Philip Leon or Bernardo Kashup. It doesn't matter what type of naturalism you're talking about. The point is that naturalism is not going to be a simple theory in the syntactical sense, because it's going to have to appeal to a lot of brute facts or brute necessities. And when I'm talking about brute facts or whatever, I guess I just mean like the fundamental, like the only, like, basically what everything else flows from. So some people might say, oh, well, theism has brute facts because every time that God chooses to create a universe, well, that's just a brute fact. Well, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about God's choices. What I'm talking about is just what God is, right? So we're talking about what it is, whatever the foundation is, whatever that one entity is, that's going to be simpler because it can explain everything given its nature, whereas naturalism is just not going to be able to do that in my mind. So when Swinburne is talking about simplicity, that's what he's referring to. So I just wanted to point that out to you and as well as to the audience. And then he made some comments about how time is temporal. Now, I would agree with you that that God is temporal, and I would also agree with the physicist you cited, which was Ravelli or something. I forgot.
Carlo Rovelli.
Yeah, I actually would agree with him that time is relative and that time is just a relation, right? And so I'd take the view that God is temporal and that how do you say it? So basically, God is temporal, and when God relates to something, that's what time is, right? So God does not create time, right? Time is just a consequence of God being in relation to something, whatever it is. It could be the universe, or it could be, something in the universe, or whatever. The point is that time is just a relation. God does not create time. Rather, time is just a consequence of relations, right? And so that, I think, fits with the relativistic view of time, which is what I hold to. And then I guess the last points was, having to do with intelligent design. Now, I just want to be clear. I don't hold to intelligent design. I think I would agree with you that at least intelligent design as a scientific theory is not really a good explanation. But again, we're talking metaphysics here. So metaphysically speaking, you could say that intelligent design, is some form of theism, but you get my point. So that's okay. What I have to say in summary. And if you want to go over the specifics, we can.
A couple questions.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, why should we favor a simple explanation?
Well, it depends. So I think that we should have the least amount of brute facts, right? Or at least the least amount of fundamental postulates, right? Otherwise, well then, if you're going to have a very complex theory, and when I mean by complex, if you're going to have a bunch of unexplained or fundamental postulates, right? That's not going to really be very virtuous because you're having to explain things with a lot, right? Whereas you have another theory which can explain the most with the least. So we want a theory that can explain the most with the least. And that's, like I said in our last conversation, that's what scientists to this day are still trying to figure out, which is a theory of everything, where we find this one equation, this one fundamental, symbol or whatever,
Yeah,
and to then derive the other laws.
Unification theory. There are others, however, who have moved on from that. It could just be that the universe is not explicable through a simple unitary theory.
Well, yeah, I do. It's interesting because I do think that you could make that argument under a certain, what I call, paradigm. So I would agree that if you're operating under a certain paradigm of science, in this case, I would say it's physicalism, then I don't think you can have that, right? You can't have that sort of theory. Now, I mean, unless you're an instrumentalist or something, but like if you're talking scientific realism, right? I think the paradigm is going to have to shift. Basically, you're going to have to rethink the concept of what matter actually is until you can actually make a coherent theory. So one of the ideas that physicists have been talking about is well, let's just get rid of space and time. Let's say, well, space and time are not the fundamental nature of reality. We're not going to be able to take space and time and unify it into something else's space and time. No, just get rid of space and time altogether. And so that's where the research is heading in right now, at least, is, well, because space and time, that doesn't seem to be a very good criteria, or at least that doesn't seem to be the bottom layer, right? Because it's complex, right? So you're going to have to find something different that can, a sort of simpler explanation that doesn't appeal to at least space and time, right?
Right. But history shows something different. There's always been this quest for a simple explanation of the entire universe. And every time we get one of those, it blows up. You talk about a paradigm shift, and that actually comes into play. Like what Kuhn was talking about, science doesn't progress incrementally. It works within a rational explanation until experience stretches it to the popping point, the bursting point, and now we need a new paradigm. And actually, I write about it. A paradigm is really just a metaphor. And if you look at science, what it is a history of metaphors to try to explain their equations. And we're in one of those crises right now where the metaphors don't work. The old paradigms don't work, and they are searching for another. But every time we do this, every time we go to a new paradigm shift, things get more complicated, not less. I know I used the example of in the 19th century, people thought physics was finished because the principle of atoms perfectly explained all the chemical processes we see around us. And then a few decades later, Neil Bohr blew that up because you found another layer that was even more complicated. And over the decades since Bohr, it has only become even more complicated and more confounding. And we can't even understand the quantum world that he discovered. It's the same thing with relativity. Things just get more and more complicated. And the more that we learn, the less the rational things fit together. University of Chicago just confirmed the very strange behavior of muon G2, which is threatening the entire standard model because the universe isn't.
No, I agree. I agree with you that the universe is complex, right?
Right.
So I agree with you.
Simple explanation for it. So simplicity, to my
well, at least not in physical terms. At least not that we know of yet, right? Because we don't have a grand theory. At least not yet.
No, and
right?
I think they're quite decisively demonstrated we're never going to have one, because I mean, if you look at his ELE, the epistemological law of empiricism, any rational system is to a certain degree arbitrary by chosen events and banded tightly by space and time. And if you move beyond that, the rational system no longer holds.
Well, that's the problem, is space and time, right? So space and time, we just get rid of that. We just say, okay, well, space and time is not the fundamental nature of reality. Then we have to use whole new mathematics or physical theories to describe reality.
But that's where we run into trouble. We're in real trouble at that point. Now, you talked about a new mathematics, and that's always, Newton needed a new mathematics. He needed calculus. And then we had relativity, and Euclidean geometry can't describe it because, it assumes parallel lines will never meet. And now suddenly we know parallel lines have to meet. We needed new mathematics, and it turned out Riemannian geometry was applicable to relativity. Then we got to the quantum level and needed a whole new type of mathematics.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And now we're at the point where it's pretty clear space and time do not exist at the elemental level. I mean, Carl wrote a brilliant book that everybody ought to read, The Order of Time. I have not been so impressed by a book since the first time I read it either. I mean, really, he's not only the foremost physicist in this area, he's our best philosopher and probably our best poet. But I mean, he shows pretty clearly how at the base level there is no time, which means there's no past, there's no present, there's no future, and there's no space. These things emerge, but they only emerge from our perspective. They don't actually exist that way. So what do we do at this point? And we were in trouble with the Schrodinger equation. Now we're in big trouble because we evolved to understand the Newtonian realm. Our reason and our understanding evolved so that we were successful on the savannah. It had nothing to do with finding truth. It just said, let's really grossly oversimplify our immediate surroundings so it's something we can manipulate. And that is inextricably bound with space and time. We cannot conceive of existence without space and time.
Basically, yeah. I mean, there's here. Let me see if I can find a paper.
What you do with science at that point? It's like we hit the wall, and we couldn't tunnel through it. And now we're looking at all the little tiny particles from this collision coming off and trying to get hints, but we cannot think outside space and time. Every time we try to describe it, we end up using temporal or spatial terms. There's no way around it for us. We are in what we've discovered is at bottom, we can't begin to comprehend the universe. So it's not going to be a simple explanation.
Can you share a screen again?
Sure.
Yeah. So there's this paper by, I can't pronounce their name correctly. They have like weird names, but basically they argue that space and time basically are in the brain. Like these concepts, space and time,
right,
are basically just useful ways of surviving. Now, here's the thing. Okay, so as an idealist like myself, I would actually agree with that space and time are basically constructions of experience, right? That experience, because another problem, I'm glad that you mentioned how we have a problem in physics and how we make sense of things. But we also have but here's the thing. We also have another problem in a different field, which is neuroscience and specifically the philosophy of mind, right? How do you get first person qualities from third person qualities, right? So that's termed the hard problem, right? Now there's I don't think there's a solution to it, at least not in reductionistic terms. Now there are other theories, right? So you have dualism, you got panpsychism, right? But all those have their own problems as well, right? The dualist is going to have an interaction problem. They're not going to be able to explain how you even, like, how do these things even interact, right? And then the panpsychist is going to have some sort of combination problem, right? So it's not going to really. Right. And so, as from my perspective, it's like, well, how do we solve these two problems in these two different fields? Well, let's just say that experience is primary, and then explain the world in terms of that. Like we just, we take our mathematics, right, from physics, and we just say, okay, those mathematics, those are just abstractions
Right.
of the mental, right? And then we explain reality in terms of experience. So then all those problems just basically so it actually explains why, like, it explains consciousness, but it also explains these problems in physics, right?
Again, in a strange way, we agree.
Interesting.
I'm very much influenced by Heidegger. In fact, he's my starting point for everything. And one of the things he noticed was just about all of our problems in philosophy that we haven't been able to solve over the last 25 centuries are due to the error of metaphysics and asking the wrong question. And the hard problem of consciousness is one of those. We're not going to solve it asking the questions we're asking. It's not going to be solved. I suspect quantum mind theory, especially Penrose's OR, is going to give us some very helpful insights at some point, but we're asking the wrong question. It's the same thing with free will. We're asking the wrong question. And I believe when we say, well, is there a God? Again, we're asking the wrong question. And that's why these things never get resolved. We get caught up in the illusions of metaphysics and end up really discussing nothing. But it comes back to, you said what the key is. Let's be introspective. Let's inspect our experience, which means being around us. Any answers that we can get will be from our interacting and being introspective about the immediate world as we can experience it. We can't experience it without time and space. That's not given to us. But we can also experience aesthetically. There's a fascinating new approach to consciousness that we've been asking the wrong question all along. We've been looking at the very late development of the cerebral cortex and thinking that that consciousness is it's rational, it's something that we think, but it's not. Consciousness is in the brainstem. We live, we experience everything aesthetically, through the senses. We later learned to think about these things, but we were conscious as beings far before we developed Homo sapiens. It's an emotion, and that's all it is an emotion that we have evolved and refined over time. And that gets us back to experience. It gets us back to trying to, maybe we need to avoid the error of over-rationalization. Reason is a tool. It's a pragmatic tool. It's not a way to the truth. All the rational systems break down. Aesthetics really don't. Maybe we need to think, as Heidegger said, poetically about what being really is. Refrain from the temptation of making metaphysical explanations and hold tight to the experience, see where it takes us. And to me, that's the only way we're ever going to really know anything, but it's a different kind of knowledge. We're not going to have the grand unification theory. There's not going to be an equation that we can put on a t-shirt.
It could be grand unification in the sense that we only need to use one descriptor, experience, to account for everything, right?
Yeah, but it's not, at that point, it's not an equation. You got to get away from equations.
Oh, no, I agree. I'm with you there. Like, yeah.
And science always does too. They're squeamish about this, but they always resort to metaphor, which is poetry. Every single scientific theory is at the end of metaphor. Kuhn calls them a paradigm, but they're metaphors.
No, yeah. So would you agree that, like, we should not mathematize everything? Like, mathematization is like it's useful, right? But at the end of the day, like metaphysically speaking, it's not going to really be helpful, right?
Exactly. I agree. We agree on a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mathematics is it's an engineering tool. We can build things with mathematics to a degree, but it doesn't have anything to do with truth. And again, back to Poincaré. I mean, that was his point that Wigner picked up on with his four geometries. Yeah, he's got four geometries with contradictory assumptions that are internally 100% coherent. None of them tells you the truth, but they have practical applications. Euclidean geometry has practical applications for Newtonian physics. Riemannian geometry has practical applications for relativity, but neither of them is the truth. And that's what ELE is all about.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Trying to understand ultimate reality through an equation is never going to happen. Because what do my physicists always, in the end, squeamishly end up with metaphors?
Well, maybe that's the issue. Maybe it's not that we can't unify these things, but maybe we can't unify it through mathematics. Maybe that's the problem.
I would go with you on that. In a sense, I wrote an essay on this. Our logical thinking, the way that we have thought the last 25 centuries is a series of reductions. And that's what reason is all about. But if you look at Penrose's or consciousness begins with reduction. It's a reduction of the wavelength of waveform to it's a reduction of superposition to eigenstate. That is the beginning. That's the first bit of consciousness. Then we as humans have reason, and we reduce things even more, as we pointed out. I mean, a rational system is a bigger reduction yet. And metaphors in science are reductive metaphors. It takes what's unknowable and tries to make it into a simple example. Poetic metaphor is exactly the opposite. It takes a simple thing that we know and expands it to give you a presence of what you can't know, a presence, a sense of the awesomeness. The metaphor is really the key. But now, getting back to the Swinburne, that is why that's one of the reasons I simply can't accept his argument. He posits a universe that doesn't exist. He also
so that's interesting. So because so I guess I should clarify, because Swinburne, he's a substance dualist, right? So because of that, he's going to posit a reality of like space and time,
right?
A physical reality of like mindless matter, and that God can explain that. Well, from my perspective, well, technically, I'm not sure, because as an idealist, I don't even believe in mindless matter, right? So my conception of the universe is going to be completely different than like Swinburne's, right? Just like my conception is going to be different than the physicalist conception. So maybe it's not that theism. It's not that theism can or cannot explain the universe, but rather that theism, like whatever comes from theism, like theism doesn't predict a mindless universe. And if that's the point that I guess you're trying to make, I could be wrong here, but maybe I could probably agree to that. Like, well, yeah, theism does not predict a mindless universe, because a mindless universe is there's nothing internal to God that really accounts for why God would create such a world like that. So I think it gets complicated, right? Because
sure it does.
I think that, at least on my version of theism, as an idealist, I would say, well, God created the world, but the world is just experience, right? It's not like the world is objective. It's not like the world is made of like objective space and time and, particles and stuff. Well, no, I don't accept that, really. On my view, space and time are constructions of experience, right? And that the world is just experience, and that's it. there's really not much else to it. It's relatively simple. It could sort of explains our experience of the world, and it also explains why mathematicians and physicists it explains why we create these abstractions, right? So you're talking about abstractions of mathematics and stuff,
Right.
So one way to think of it is, well, what you could say. One question, one clarification: are you a nominalist about mathematics, or are you a realist about mathematics?
Probably neither. Metaphysical
Okay.
economies are never going to fit me. I see,
Okay.
but I'll tell you what I think of mathematics. It's an offshoot of reason. It's rational manipulation of number that started out almost like as an aesthetic. I mean, Pythagoras and his mathematics was purely aesthetics. It wasn't until later on there was a forced applicability to the world, in that we saw different things and we decided to count them as separate things. And mathematics had a practical, application.
Right. No.
But it's really just it's simply in the mind. It's part of the rationality that we impose
that we invented.
The world.
Yeah. So this is how I think of it. Okay. So take hold on. Okay. So take a math equation, right, or whatever. See, okay, this math equation is, let's say, it's describing a particle. Now, what do? Well, we just take that math equation and take the particle and then strip it of its math. Take away the math. Well, what are you left with? You're not left with anything, right? What you're basically left with is experience, or at least the experience of that particle or field or whatever. But the point I'm trying to make here is that when you strip away mathematics from physics, right? There's nothing left. Right. All that's left is the experience of what's there. So,
well, there's nothing left in a naturalistic approach. There's everything left in the aesthetic experience, the poetic understanding of what's going on around you.
Right.
When I talked about reductivism, in our modern mode of thought is a series of reductions toward, because it uses scientific metaphor, which is simplification. If you go into poetic or artistic aesthetic metaphor, it's just the opposite. It doesn't reduce, and it's why it moves you more than an equation. That's why listening to a Beethoven symphony is very different from listening to somebody analyze it, from a music standpoint. Because in the music itself, all of the contradictions and irrationality and superpositions come at you unmediated. And when you listen to Beethoven, there's everything from the ephemeral highs of the stars to the very troubling deep bass that looks like the whole foundation's about to come out from under you. It's all in there in its complexity, and it hits you in the brainstem. We can think about all these things later, but you'll never ever be able to put a symphony or into words. You never will.
No, right.
And ever be able to form, to reduce a poem to a formula. You can't do it because it is unmediated and it is not reductive. That's the whole point. It's the opposite of a scientific metaphor, but that's where we really learn things. And I've said a million times before.
Yeah.
If you want to understand what morality is, forget all of the analytic philosophers' petty arguments and theories about it. Read the Brothers Karamazov. In the end, it'll scar you for life, because it was brought to your presence and you felt it unmediated. And from now on, you're going to know what morality is. You might not be able to describe it in a formula, but you just experienced it. And it gets to your question of experience.
Well, I guess one clarification. So one of your criticisms. So your criticism of Swinburne is not that theism can't explain it, but rather the universe that Swinburne believes in does not exist. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly right. Right. And since the universe that he believes in does not exist, his criterion of simplicity is invalid.
Well, I mean, again, I guess with simplicity, he's talking about fundamental simplicity. I guess, I mean, it gets interesting because when you start talking about like other types of simplicities, like ontological simplicity, for example, I think that idealism is actually the ontologically simple theory. At least if it's not the simplest theory, it's at least it's on pair with like a sort of physicalism in terms of ontological simplicity, right? Because on physicalism, we're going to say is, well, reality is just made of one kind of stuff, and that's mindless matter. Whereas the idealist is going to say, well, reality is made of one kind of stuff, which is matterless mind. Well, how are you going to compare them?
I'm going to say there's no such thing as just one kind of stuff. There's being in its manifold, it's ever changing, it's contradictory, it's overwhelming, and you're not going to understand it if you reduce it to either materialism or naturalism or to idealism. They're both metaphysical errors.
Well, I mean, your view sounds like an absolute idealist in a way.
No, exactly the opposite. I mean, if I were to put myself in some sort of modern term, which I try not to do, it would be a non-reductive physicalist. I believe that all there is the physical, reality around us. But that's, first of all, it's not materialism because at fundamental level, there is no matter. There's only waves. There's no matter until later on when when one field interacts in a certain way with a Higgs field, matter emerges, but that's not elemental, that's fundamental. Most of the universe as it exists right now does not exist as matter. So that's, I'm not a materialist. The universe is wave. I mean, that's what Ravelli, that's what most physicists, any quantum field physicist certainly understands, that all that really exists waves. That's it.
Well, I think we need it. Well, I mean, at that point, then that just pushes the question back. Well, what is a quantum field, right?
Yeah. Well, that's and this takes us to the crisis of physics once again, because I don't know how we go beyond that. We understand it as waves in a field, which once again puts us in spatial temporal terminology when we know that it doesn't exist that way. We interpret it as waves. We interpret rhythm, but it exists where there is no time. So that's not really how it is, and we can't push it back further. That's crisis of physics. Try to explain quantum field without a temporal or spatial metaphor, and you find out you can't, because you can't think that way. So I can't. As far as the physical world given to me as a human being, it's waves in time, but I know that's not what it is. That's just my given way to experience it. But there's nothing, the error is in reducing it. A reductive approach will always lead to what Ravelli calls the myopia, the blurring of the universe, and it's his statement, time is ignorance. We only know time because we're ignorant of everything else.
Yeah. Well, okay, so that sounds interesting because it is similar to my view in the sense that I think that ultimate reality, I think ultimate reality is perfect, but I think whatever it produces is going to be some sort of like experiential states or transpersonal experiential states. In fact, I think Bernard Kashup, what he would say is, well, whatever the fundamental stuff is, right, it's just consciousness, or at least transpersonal consciousness. And when he's talking about consciousness, he's not talking like, someone like us. He's not talking like there's a conscious, self-reflexive being. It's just sort of like just that which experiences, right? So that's the language he uses. I would agree to him to a certain extent, except I think that it's ultimately self-reflexive at bottom. But anyways, so I guess one issue that I might have with that sort of form of physicalism, have you ever heard of the problem of identifying positive properties?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so basically, I guess to summarize for you in the audience is basically that when we say an object is physical, there's no way in which we can describe it in where we refer to it as an object without reference to some mental experience or properties.
Right.
Right. So we always describe a physical object in ways that are like mind dependent, right? Or depend on some sort of experience or that which experiences. And so I guess the issue, again, this is not meant as like to disprove physicalism, but it's sort of an issue because it's like, well, what do we even mean by physical, right? Like
Exactly.
mm-hmm.
I mean, what we know now, physical is really just an unimaginably complex symphony of waves of different fields. And that's just our latest metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
And all these metaphors break down. What is, we can't imagine that because we are stuck in thinking space and time. We don't have another way to do that other than maybe aesthetically. We break that a little bit. What I wanted to ask you next was, well, let me just make one other.
Okay, go ahead.
Listen, to my mind, are still physical things in the physical universe. They're not some magic thing, not some supernatural thing.
No, I agree. They're not supernatural. So.
Of waves that exist in the universe, and and that's what Penrose, that's the track that Penrose is in right now, in trying to link consciousness to the collapse of the wave function. It's a reduction, but there's we know about the observation problem, and that would be a way of looking at that problem. Is we think in waves, we measure waves. You tell us if somebody's conscious or not by measuring the brain activity, which is brain waves. So we know they radiate, and that's just how we interact with the world. Consciousness is part of the natural world. But the question I wanted to ask you is, if truth is found in experience, and experience can only be of the physical world around us, why do you need a concept of God?
Well, yeah, so it gets kind of complicated because there are different models of God, right? So I guess I'll have to go with my specific model of God. So my model of God is basically that God is a maximally, well, I guess I forgot the exact words to describe it. Basically, God, on my view, is, hold on, let me see, because I wrote it down somewhere. God is a supremely self-aware mind, is supremely mental, right? So God created the world out of, I think that God created the world from his own mind, his own contents. And God would know the contents of his own mind. So, he would be omniscient. He would have omnisubjectivity and so forth. So I think that God is just the simplest kind of mental thing, right? Or at least, since God is a mind, he's think in terms of like a panentheism, right? We have God as like the sort of like the absolute mind, that knows its own experiences, right? Its own contents, and we as us, we are just dissociated alters or dream characters of God. So basically, we're in God's dream.
How do you know?
Sounds kind of weird, but
how do you know?
Well, I think it's just it's part of my theory of idealism. But one way I sort of argue for it, there's a few ways, but one of the more recent ways I've been sort of thinking about it is, well, again, let's just talk about syntactic simplicity and ontological simplicity, right? So we only need to appeal to experience to explain the world. And well, in order to explain the external world, we have to appeal to something, right? But if the external world is not space and time, if it's not mindless matter, they're going to have something different. And what I would say is, well, the external world is just transpersonal experiences being, held by a transpersonal mind or an absolute mind, right? Now, of course, you don't have to go that route. You could say, well, the experiences out there are just sort of brute, right? But then that's going to be a theoretical cost on my view. So you start off with the smallest number of commitments, right? Fundamental commitments. And then from that, God will create, or I guess mentalize a world of experience. And that's the world we live in right now. So and that's all we really need to appeal to, right? So I don't accept like the supernatural. I don't think there's a real good distinction between natural and supernatural. So I mean, in a real way, like I could call myself a naturalist. Like if you want to, some people define naturalism in such a way where I could actually call myself a naturalist, right? And I guess the only real difference is I think God is, absolutely perfect, right? So an absolutely perfect being would be mental, right? It would know its own content and stuff. But that's pretty much it. That I think it's just the simplest, most syntactically simple theory, and it's the most ontologically simple theory as well.
Right.
And it can explain all of these different phenomena. So
Yeah, and even though we agree on a lot of things, I have the same problem with that I do with Swinburne. Why am I looking for the simplest explanation when all of my experience tells me that the universe is infinitely complex? So I'm not concerned about simplicity. I'm innately skeptical of simplistic explanations. So I'm not looking for simple. I also don't have then there's the metaphysical. I mean, we've reverted to metaphysics
no, yeah,
again.
that is.
I have absolutely no reason. There's nothing in my experience to suggest that there is this omniscient consciousness that is forming us. There's a universe that is forming us, and it may even have intention and unconscious intention. I there are things in experience that suggest that, but that's not something I can actually know right now. But I suspect it might be. Penrose, by the way.
Yeah.
But I don't need a God.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like we have. I don't know. We might have different conceptions of like the universe itself, right? So when you say that the universe is self-aware, well, that's very similar to my own view, where if we're in God's mind,
I'm saying that it's not self-aware.
Oh, okay.
Until we came along, and now it is in a tiny little pocket to a very primitive small.
Yeah. So I guess
part of the universe. We're part of being, and we are that part of the universe that is experiencing itself. We're the part of being that is experiencing itself in events, in experience. And before us, that didn't exist. And perhaps there's an intention in the universe for that to happen and to become conscious of itself, become increasingly more aware. Maybe. I mean, I don't know. That's just one way to understand it. But I don't have any reason to go beyond that. There is a conscious universe right now. I see nothing in my experience suggests that. To get to that idea, I need to revert to metaphysics and try to unify what my experience tells me cannot be unified.
Yeah. I guess that sounds interesting because it seems like at least on both of our views, we want to keep ontological simplicity, right? So we don't want to we don't want to have extra entities, right?
Well, I don't think again, that those are
Mm-hmm.
metaphysical terms that I don't think there aren't entities. There's
Well, I mean, okay, so I guess one clarification: would you accept the sort of distinction between contingency and necessity?
no. That's causality that only happens within confined rational systems.
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily causality. I mean, you could have like an infinite regress of causes, right? But I think
But
the
it's
point with
still
contingency
causality.
is, I know, but I think the point is that you could have what's called non-causal grounding, right? So basically, you have something ground something else. So even if there's like it's this infinite chain of contingent things, whatever it
Yes,
is,
yeah,
right? You could have grounding, right?
yes,
So,
to me that's an important concept. But again,
mm-hmm.
it will work very differently with me than it does with you. We're grounded in the possibilities of the being of this universe. That's what we're grounded in. There's an essence to this universe and its possibilities that grounds us.
Right.
And by experiencing it and experiencing ourselves, we get insight into what some of this is. But that's all that grounds us is
Because
our
that's
nature.
well, because that's interesting. Because what I would just say is, well, God just grounds us, right?
Yeah, but then now you've gone a step that we don't need to take. We don't need God for that. We don't need to think of a God. We just need to think of the essence of being in this universe. There's nothing else necessary.
So you're saying that the universe is like that is like necessary? Like that's the sort of ground of everything?
It's the universe is the ground of everything. In necessity isn't the concept that comes into play.
Okay. Well, I mean, so that's interesting because at least on my view, that would be you're adding something. So in order to preclude theism, you have to like specify what the foundation for reality is, right? Whether it's universe or something else. But the point I'm trying to make here is like you're gonna have to specify, like they're not ontologically neutral. Like so theism versus like something like your view, they're not ontologically neutral, right? So you're gonna have to actually posit something to ground it, regardless of if it's God or something else. But the point is that you have to posit something.
And I'm not taking in. But here's the important distinction, and it's the reaction of metaphysics. I ground it in what I experience directly, physically in this world. I know it's there. To me, physical. I mean, that the universe exists is a brute fact. I don't know why it exists. I can't know why it exists. It's not even a sensible question for me.
Well,
it just is.
Yeah.
Go into a God. Now I've made a metaphysical jump that I don't have to make.
Well, it's interesting that you said that you only need to appeal to experiences, and then we don't. That's all we need to do. Like just appeal to like the universe, and the universe sort of grounds everything.
Yes.
But I guess one question I have is, what is internal to the universe that explains its own necessity?
That's not a sensible question as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Well, maybe that's
simply is.
Maybe
is. We can't go beyond that. There's no honest way of going beyond just saying it is.
Okay, that's just I guess that's the last point I just want to bring up, just because one thing I've been thinking about is like how you explain necessities, right? And I think that any sort of naturalism is not going to be able to explain necessities, whereas theism can explain necessities. Like the fact that God is perfect would entail that God has necessary existence. So, in that sense, then you have two views where you have one view that, let's just compare it with your form versus, my sort of form. So we both agree that experience, at least that's all we can really know ultimately at the end of the day, right?
Right.
So we're going to have epistemic limitations. We can agree to that. We can agree that like space and time are constructions for the most part. We're there. I think the main difference between our views is the grounding, right? So
yes, exactly. And that comes down to metaphysics. I have no reason to jump beyond the physical immediate reality because I don't have a reason to believe there is anything else.
Yeah. So are you saying that because what you could say is, well, I don't know what the ground is. Like, the ground may be God, or maybe it's not God. But the point is that the ground is whatever the ground is. I don't know. And if that's the point, if that's what you're saying, I mean, you could be wrong here,
but I'm not really saying that. I'm saying the ground. I know what the ground is. Do I understand the ground? No, not really. I experience it, and the more that I contemplate that experience, the more I get some insight into the essence of reality. And all of that reality is grounded in, being, which just means what is. And it has an essence. To me, the question is there intention in that essence or isn't there? But there isn't a question for me about, is there a God? But it's a nonsensical question because
well, I mean, it also depends what we mean by God, right? Because I would say that God is perfectly rational, right? So we can actually get access to that as well. So
why would a perfectly rational God create a completely, at its most fundamental level, irrational world? It makes no sense. That gets us back to Swinburne's error, which is the ground of his looking for simplicity. It goes back to the medieval conception that God is perfectly rational, created a perfectly rational universe, and gave man reason so that he could understand God's creation. We know that isn't true. That's not how the universe actually is. So if there's a
well, I mean,
God,
the universe may not be right. So the universe may not be like, actually have like objective space and time, but that doesn't mean it's not rational.
Sure it
right?
does. No, that's actually a bigger, more important point than space and time. Although reason is limited in space, time, and chosen event. It's arbitrary. You can have contradictory assumptions and contradictory explanations of events that both are internally consistent and rational, but they mean opposite things. Just like heliocentric and geocentric views of the universe. They were both completely rational. They both did just as well at predicting night skies. And one of them was way off, and the other, we'll probably find out, is not all that exact either. Now that we know that space and time are later emergence. So
yeah, that sounds like
there is no rationality other than what we impose.
So what you're saying is that there's no at least there's contradictions in the appearance of reality. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that, but I'm saying more than that. I'm saying reason was never evolved to tell us any truths about the universe. Reason evolved so that it evolved in a way that greatly reduced reality. Like you mentioned Hoffman last time, and this is exactly what it's almost 21st century Kantianism in a way. It takes the manifold of sense data, which is overwhelming, greatly reduces it to a few icons that have direct relevance to our immediate practical needs, and allows us to make plans off of or make predictions off of this greatly reduced representation that is nothing like reality itself. So reason isn't, it's not a rational world, nor does it need to be. Reason is just simply imposed on a very, very small band of reality in order for practical reasons. In the works, we've expanded it into engineering, and with limited ranges, it works spectacularly well. But it doesn't tell us anything about the ultimate reality of the universe.
I think you would like the what's his name? F.H. Bradley. Have you read him?
Mm-mm.
Okay, I would recommend you read his work. I haven't read all of it myself either. But he does talk about at least the fact that there's this distinction makes between appearance and reality. And so appearance, he says, he's the one that came up with the Bradley regress. And he basically argues, he uses one principle, which is the principle of non-contradiction. and then he shows the contradictions in the appearances of reality, and he argues that,
sure.
well, everything that we know of is, at least in space and time, that's not the ultimate nature of reality because it has all these like contradictions and inconsistent, right? And then he presents a different view, what he in his book called Reality, where he actually presents his idea of the absolute, and the absolute on his mind is just absolute experience. And he's an idealist as well, but this idea of absolute experience, this sort of like super relational whole. If you go on YouTube, there's this YouTube channel called Pessimistic Idealism. I've talked to him a few times, and he has a video on Bradley. So if you want to get like
I'll take a look at that.
gist of it. But I guess my point is, like, I could probably, if we're talking about the appearance of reality, then perhaps that is what, is irrational, right? But I think ultimately, I think reason can discover, reality. But
why?
I mean,
why do you think that?
Well, I mean, I just don't see any other way. Otherwise, we can't know anything, right?
No, we can know aesthetically.
Aesthetically, interesting.
Well, that's what experience is.
Mm-hmm.
Experience is our aesthetic journey through our life, through the world. We experience everything aesthetically. That's our mode of existence, and it's non-reductive. That's why, if we get very rational about morality, we block what morality actually is. If we get aesthetic about morality, like the brothers Karamazov, it's actually present before us. Now we can't listen to, because it's not reduced, and it overwhelms us, but we know what it is. We know it in an aesthetic way, and that's what music and art and poetry is all about. And that's why it's considered great, because it brings to our presence unmediated experience of the essence of being. That's what
I mean that does. I'm not sure that's incompatible with reason. I mean, I could probably agree. I would agree that, like, we can't mathematize it, right? Or something like that. Like I'm with you on that, but I'm not sure, because it seems like reason is just, when you're thinking about like an irrational universe, I can't imagine what an irrational.
But you can't imagine it other than through profound art or profound music, because you can experience it. Just like I said to Beethoven, if you really, really just give yourself over to a Beethoven orchestral piece, you will experience it. You can't put it into a formula. You can't even really put it into words, but you can experience it. And it's the same thing with great poetry. Great art does the same thing. It brings you right up to that revelation of the world, which you can't, but it's not reduced to reason. Reason always reduces. That's what it does. It reduces. And when you reduce, you end up with what Ravello calls blurring of the universe and ignorance. It only makes sense because you're ignorant of the great, vast reality and focusing on just a couple of little representations, and you make that seem to be rational. But the rest of it, that's not the universe. It's ephemeral. It's relative, and it's only emergent from ignorance. That's what reason does. It makes us ignorant of all of the contradictions, all of the incomprehensibility that's at the elementary level of reality. Reason is not there at the base of reality. It just isn't there. It's in our brains. It's a construct in our brains. It's an adaptation with great practical value. But it's got nothing to do with finding the truth. It's got nothing to do with that. The world isn't that way. We imagine it that way so that we can manipulate tiny little aspects of it.
Well, because it sounds weird, because what if, I mean, how would you even be able to make an argument that reason is like, because then you're gonna have to presuppose reason in order to show that reason, ultimately doesn't really exist, or
No,
something.
you that's that internal contradiction thing, and I don't think it works that way. I don't make a rational argument. I just say, look, it doesn't hold up. It reduces things that I can more fully experience aesthetically, and it always breaks down. Over history, every rational system is broken down. They always do, going back to
Well, I mean,
Vignali.
I would agree that
So
at least a lot of
I'm
logical
not going to make a
systems.
theoretical. I don't need a theoretical argument about that. I can say it doesn't work. I mean, just look at history. It doesn't work. It's reductive. It takes all the aesthetic, all the aesthetic reality. It filters it out and leaves us with something somewhat empty, that I can experience another way. And that's all I need to do. I'm not going to make a rational argument. I'm not going to get caught up in that, in internal incoherence. I'm just going to point to it fails. It always has, always will, and reduces my experience to something that we think we can understand. It's an illusion.
Yeah.
Whereas the aesthetic experience is unmediated. It's just simply experiencing what is there. Now we go on then and make interpretations of it.
No, yeah, because I think
that's what we do. But that's so it's so much less important than the actual experience.
Well, I mean, it might be. Well, one way I like to think about it. So you said, oh well, we only need to appeal to what we directly experience, right? But there also has to be a grounding for that experience, right? It's not like unless you want to be a solipsist, right? Unless you want to ground yourself.
No. The grounding is my connection to being.
Okay.
That quantum connect. I'm a quantum being. You're a quantum being in a quantum world. A strange thing, because we can't imagine what that is, but that's a reality. And that's what I'm grounded in. That quantum connection to this quantum universe. That's my grounding.
Yeah. Okay,
Where does that leave us, Kyle?
Yeah. At least we agreed a lot, most. I mean, we're gonna have some disagreements here and there, but I find it interesting how we could agree to a lot, especially like physics and stuff, and the role of science, and all that stuff. So.
Yeah, and the difference is you hold on to metaphysics. I resolutely abandoned it, and I'm going to stay with the physical. But I have greatly enjoyed our discussions. I thank you so much for being here. And perhaps we'll talk again soon. You've given me a lot to think about, and this has been a great discussion.
Yeah, I guess one thing, again, I recommend you read Bradley. F.H. Bradley is a really good idealist philosopher. Sure. I guess, and then another thing you might want to think about is explaining necessities, right? I think that might be another, because you mentioned how.
I have thought about that, and that's a metaphysical concept that I reject. Necessity doesn't. It's kind of a meaningless concept. If we're talking about necessities of how we came about, and that's a subtle question, we should even be thinking about that. That's going to lead us to metaphysical speculation that is completely detached from reality, doesn't tell us anything. That's part of the 25th century era that we're trying to overcome. And necessities within experience, we intuit causality on things that habitually occur. I'm with Hume on that one. But we know that below that, at the base level, it's indeterminate. where there isn't any deterministic causality, really. That's only something we intuit in a very confined, small space of reality. And like I said,
Yeah.
those always break down. So necessity, that's one of those metaphysical terms I don't bother with.
Okay.
All right. Thanks again. And if anybody, I'm always looking for people who, understand the issues. If they want to come on and question the things that I put out here on video, you're always welcome. We can have a nice conversation. Well, thanks, Kyle. And
Yep.